It has been a crazy week for anyone holding Cardano. Last Friday it was at a low of 58 cents, and then 3 days later it had doubled up to 120, and it is now halfway between that low and high, trading at about 84 cents. It has been a roller coaster, and I pray for anybody who's had a leveraged position during this time, because oh my god, no one would have survived this. Unless you longed here, you were getting wiped out. If you did long here, congratulations. I hope you cashed out at like $1.10. But goddamn, it's been wild. But interestingly, I wouldn't argue that it wasn't unforeseeable. And before I get into that, I want to quickly give a TLDR. If you can't be bothered, if you've only got 2 minutes, I personally think Cardano is going to slowly continue to trade up, basically. We're going to follow this imaginary support line, more or less. In 2 months, I might change it to something like this, or it might be something like this. But I think we're going to follow a slow, steady upward support. Maybe we'll get a few wicks below, but I think this is the lowest Cardano will go now. I don't think we'll wick lower than this. Of course, it's possible. It's just what I think. But I also think not much will happen over the next few weeks/months. I think it's going to more or less be sideways. Why do I say that, you ask? That's a very important question. You shouldn't just take me at face value. You should understand why I think this. That is, of course, if you have watched the channel before, or you've watched a Cardano video that I've made, you'll know that the point of these videos is to compare to previous price action. I can't predict or quantify what an announcement will do for price. So I don't even try, I just focus completely on historical data and try and find similarities that we can apply to the current day and the future. And in my opinion, I think Cardano has been following what it was doing back in 2019 from about mid-2023. And we can see I've mapped this out. I've got nice colors and lines to help illustrate this. But very quickly, the key points, we start at our low, which is usually the cycle low after the peak. So we get a peak. This is the lowest point that we come down to, give or take. We then get a strong rally up. We then get a pullback and a slightly higher high, pullback, slightly higher high. And these highs are 12 weeks apart. Same first cycle here, same second cycle. This all happens before the halving. There is, of course, some variation. So here we trend down. This takes place before the halving in this first cycle back in 2019. But here it occurs before, during, and after the halving when we finally bottom out. Another variation that I kind of argue isn't a variation. It's just a response, basically, to an announcement, which I don't try to call. But funnily enough, I think it is arguable that this is the COVID move, basically. I'm arguing that even if we didn't have the COVID sell-off, we still would have seen something pretty similar play out. Because the time frame here, from this low to this low, or this low is where we started rallying up, the time frame from here, this low to this low, is 12 weeks. It's the same thing that we got this cycle, basically. We had a low, and instead of going up and then down, and then moving up, we just traded sideways. So we spent the same amount of time, and the end product was the same. The price was more or less where it was when it started. So for me, it's a variation, but the end product was the same. Nothing really changed. We then get a strong move from this low, and I'll also point out the general time frames as well for all of this happening, from green to purple, 66 weeks here, green to purple, 60 weeks here. Very similar time frames. We get this rally, and we peak out in line with the previous peaks. So you can see if we draw a resistance line from these peaks, it lines up more or less with the one that we got in July of 2020. Same thing here. And if we're measuring from these peaks as well, if we're including these, it's the exact same story. It lines up with this peak more or less perfectly. So far I'd argue there's about a year and a half of data that's more or less a translation, like a copy and paste almost, of what we've had, and that's up until very recently. And now finally getting to the answer of the question, why do I think we're just going to trade sideways for the next few weeks? Well, it's very much based on what happened last time. If we zoom in back on 2020, and again we assume this high is the one that we got over here at the start of December last year, it took us 18 weeks here for us to break back above this high. It took 18 weeks. And in that time, we got a low, but we generally followed a slow, steady trend up. If we apply that logic, move that over to what we're currently going through, 18 weeks puts us at the start of April when we should break above this previous peak. Again, this is if it wants to follow exactly what happened last cycle to the T in terms of time frame, which it doesn't have to. And realistically, it probably won't. Even though all of this has been so similar already, I'm sure there will be some degree of variation. And that's the same with the lows. We can see we got this low. Let me measure it quickly. We got this low from the peak. It took us 9 weeks to bottom out there. If we measure last cycle, it took us 9 weeks again. The similarities are pretty crazy, to be honest with you. There is still a good chance that we dip below this. I personally don't think we will. I think we will just see this trend line follow up. We might need to adjust it in, say, a month. I might have to move this line up like this, or I might have to move it down. It might be flatter, it might be more harsh up. I don't know. This is just a placeholder for the moment, but that's generally what I think. I think Cardano will slowly trend up. What is interesting is that we've come close to testing this high. So what's different from last cycle is that we're already coming close to pushing above this price. We haven't had a close that's above the close of the peak, and we haven't had a wick that's higher than the wick at the peak, but we haven't been far away. We've also seen a lot more volatility. Before here, last cycle, we had one strong move down, and then we basically just stayed here, and then had one strong move up. That was it. Here, we've been all over the place. Cardano hasn't been able to decide what it wants to do. It has sharp dips down, followed by really strong 1 week rallies, and then nothing for a month, and then it drops 50% of its value, 60, 70% of its value in the space of a month, and then it's right back up to these peaks. It's all over the place. It's a bit of a mess. It is, however, still completely in line with what happened last cycle. And again, like we saw with COVID, where we had this rally and this crash, we had extra volatility here, and we had no volatility this current cycle. Maybe we're just getting that volatility back. Maybe Cardano just needed to have a bit of a shakeout. It hadn't had that shakeout this cycle because it got rid of those leveraged moves back here with COVID. It wiped out the leverage, shook off a little of the riskier plays, and then it was able to rally up, and it didn't need to shake them off anymore. Here we never got that volatility. It never shook those people off. They rode all the way up, and then it decided to basically bend them over and get rid of them. It's just slightly later on in the cycle. And I mean, to me, when I zoom out here and I look at this, I don't see much of a difference between these two. And I think it's something that in 2, 3, 4 years' time, the volatility will be something to bring up. You know, here we had the volatility earlier. Here we had the volatility a bit later. But ultimately, we had the same thing, the same moves, the same time frames. A case to be made of a difference. Historically, we've seen Cardano follow a pattern of putting in a double top, more or less, with about 12 weeks between the two peaks. We saw that last cycle in 2019, where we had 12 weeks between these two peaks here. We've seen that multiple times this cycle, technically multiple times last cycle, but here we had more or less 12 weeks between these peaks. But here you can see we had close to 12 weeks between these two peaks. It depends how you want to frame it. If you want to, let me be cheeky and just take it where we had a peak here to this peak here, that's 11 weeks. You can get the idea. It takes a similar amount of time for Cardano to be at these highs, to come down, and then to get back to these highs. We get 12 weeks here as well. How long has it been since we had this first peak to the big rally that brought us close to these previous prices? If you guessed 12 weeks, congratulations. You're correct. It's 12 weeks. So it is interesting to see that this 12 is kind of reoccurring, or close to 12 anyway. Maybe this is just a double peak and we're going to see a correction, because that's one thing to note as well. Every time we've had these 12-week period double tops, we get a strong correction afterwards. We got it here back in 2019. We got it here back in 2023. And we got it here back in 2024. What's to say we don't get it here in 2025 as well? It doesn't have to keep following this pattern. There's nothing, just because it's followed it so far doesn't mean it's going to continue to follow it. There is no guarantee of that whatsoever. If you want to take more of a short-term measure of Cardano, you could kind of draw a line like this maybe. Draw this slowly, kind of slow descending wedge here. There's obviously going to be some kind of explosive move when these two lines meet, or as they get closer. Where do these two lines roughly end up? Mid to late April? When are we due to make an explosive move to the upside above past our previous high, according to Cardano's history. Well, it's supposed to be 18 weeks from that peak. That's very close to 18 weeks. And these things don't happen when they intersect. They happen before. They don't, slowly minimize until they get to the intersection and then make a strong move. It always happens before or just after. It's never the actual intersection itself. So realistically, us saying 18 weeks here, look how close that brings us. Let me just move this a little. Look how close. Can't get the hang of this. Look how close that brings us to that intersection. That's basically there. I would say a lot of things are pointing towards something big happening to Cardano in the next month. I would say historically, it's been a good thing that usually happens here, although the sample size of this data is very small. There is, though, a very reasonable chance, based on Cardano's history, that we do move to the downside. It kind of depends which pattern it wants to follow. Does it want to follow this 12-week type pattern, or does it want to follow this 18-week at this specific period of the cycle? I don't know. I personally think we're more likely to see this move to the upside. I think that would also line up with the historical crypto adage of sell in May and go away. If we start if we've broken above the previous high by the 7th of April, and we spend a month going up, I think we'll be in a pretty good place for Cardano by the time mid-May rolls around, and then I think we'll see some kind of a correction again, like we always see. We get a strong move, and then eventually a strong correction, and then a strong move, and then, these last few weeks, very strong correction. And I think that's just going to be the way it goes. Strong move, strong correction. That's my 10 cents on Cardano. Let's quickly look at the Bitcoin pair. So again, what's interesting with the Bitcoin pair as well is we've come very close here to taking out this previous high. And whereas last cycle, again, assuming that we are following roughly what happens from cycle to cycle, took us 28 weeks to move back above the high that we set after the halving, after we got roughly a 200% move. It's a bit smaller here, but I expect diminishing returns. Also, the follow-up moves were very similar, and the low was basically the same price. We can see this green line here is the low that we got during the first cycle. Here is the low that we got during the second cycle. It's the same price. We just moved up slightly less, and we moved down slightly less, and ultimately basically ended up in the same place. What's something that I haven't actually checked, it's just a sudden brain thought, is if you take this cycle from the peak, where we are now, from this peak, assuming these peaks map, the peak that I'll compare to in a minute, I want to see how far we've fallen from the peak from the current week. So we've dropped 30% at the current price after 13 weeks. And if we go back to this second cycle and we take 30% of a drop and map to week 13, we can see we're technically doing better than last cycle. But again, another important thing to note is that this cycle, all the moves were more volatile. And again, we get 135% of a move up here. We get 100%, 76% of a drop down. We get 70% of a drop. We get 200% of a rally. We get 270% of a rally here. Same moves during similar times, just the percentages are different. Is it too much of a jump to assume that we are more or less on track for this? This 40% drop can be equated to this 30% drop here. I would say that's reasonable. I wouldn't call you an idiot for making that comparison. And maybe I have a bias there because I'm making that comparison, but I think it's reasonable. I think Cardano has shown that on its Bitcoin pair, it's been less volatile this cycle. It's also had shorter time frames, whichever way you want to look at it. I mean, from this first peak to the halving, shorter time frame. From this peak to the next peak, shorter time frame. From the halving to the low, shorter time frame. Everything's been a shorter time frame, and it's been a volatile move. It's probably foolish for me to expect Cardano to have a rally 28 weeks after this peak, like it did here. You might want to take a third or a quarter off that, and if you're taking a quarter, that's going to -7 here. So it's going to bring us to 21 weeks, which would put us at the end of April, to when Cardano would make strong moves against its Bitcoin pair. That's also assuming that it's come down to these lows and then spent a few weeks rallying up. So this could be the low, this could be the bottom out. it matches. Again, it's 70% of a drop from the high. If we go back here to this cycle and measure how far we fell, it was 68%. Noticeably smaller. Again, it's my opinion here, but I think a lot of things point towards something happening towards the end of this month. Basically, in April, I would expect some kind of a move. I would expect that move to be positive. I would be more bullish than bearish. Much more bullish than bearish, to be honest with you, for mid-April. And then after that, who knows? Probably good price. I'm not going to go too into detail, but I think it will be lower highs, definitely on the Bitcoin pair at least. That's what we've seen with Cardano. For the 2 bull runs that we've got data for Cardano, for the 2 bull runs that it's existed through. So again, if it's following this very rough and ready basic trend line, and if we peak out somewhere towards the end of the year, you're looking at something most likely under 4,500 sats. I'm going to leave you to do those equations to figure out what that'll be on the US dollar chart, because this video has gone on too long and I should probably wrap it up. If you guys liked the video, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a dislike too. That's totally fine. Comment down below what I got wrong or what you want next, or if you actually agree with me. My ego needs a boost, you know? Tell me I'm totally correct. Either way, thanks so much for watching. Take care and peace.